In this tutorial, we are building a custom registration website with custom validation controls. And what I mean by custom validation controls is there are built-in validation controls into ASP.NET, and we get to customize those to do fun things such as making sure that our user is at least 18 years old. And you're going to notice this is happening on the client-side validation. We're not posting to the server. Of course, we are having matching server-side validation as well. So it is both. It is client and server-side validation with some custom rules like that. And we're also doing a remote database hit. And so you'll notice if I tab off of an email address that already exists, we're actually hitting our database to test to see if that user already exists and giving the user a very snappy error message. Of course, we can do some of the more common things like regular expressions and making sure that our, for example, making sure that our usernames don't have special characters. Of course, that error message could be a little different, saying you don't match a regular expression, but regular expression, and of course the classic, making sure your passwords match. And so this is the registration site that we are building today. And username, public string username, get set, and we'll do a little regular expression. Okay, and we have to bring in a using data annotations. So this using got brought in up at the top, and our regular expression, okay, does not allow special characters. And so here's our regular expression. Username should not contain special characters. Public string email address, get set. I'm going to say required. And we covered the display attribute so that it shows up just more user-friendly as we, in different places throughout the application, right? Both in the validation messages, it doesn't say email address in one word. In the validation message, it'll say email address in 2 words, as well as if you use those tag helpers. So changing the display on the email address. Now, we're also going to, and this is not something yet, at some point we are going to do a remote attribute to check to see if the email exists. Okay, so we're going to kind of come back to our model, and so that's a really neat feature in .NET where you can kind of do some validation based on if something exists in the database. And so that's something that we added in yesterday. We'll add it in again today, so kind of a cool thing. We'll do a date of birth, public date time nullable DOB, get set, and kind of the same thing here, required, error message, and we're also going to come back here and set up a minimum age of 13. Well, sure, let's change it to 18, right? Like you got to use a social media site, you got to be 18. You ever think that'll be law? Don't answer that question. Okay. Sure. We can change the display. And then there's two more fields. We're going to have a password and confirm password. Connor? Please enter an email address.
Well, I meant instead of the attribute required, use the attribute email address. That way it actually checks for the values of an email address.
You can. Sure. All right, let's throw in a password. Public string password get set. Error message equals. Okay, keep in mind string length is the maximum string length. And we're going to make these match. We're going to use compare to confirm password, which we have to create. I'm going to set these defaults string.empty, string.empty. Same thing with email address, string.empty. And display is confirm password and not mapped in the database. So there's no database column, which makes sense. Okay, next we have to get our database ready. So we're going to need a context file. So we're going to create a new class here called registration context. And again, this is going to basically create our table inside of a database. It needs to inherit from DB context, but in order for DB context to be a thing, we have to install the NuGet package for Entity Framework. So let's go into here, NuGet solution, click on browse, and install these two tools that we've done many times now for Entity Framework. And get the green check mark. Do the other one for tools. Okay, so now we got two green check marks there. So now we can inherit from DB context. And it will catch up, control dot, add a using statement up top. Entity Framework core, once that caught up, we should be good. And now we need a constructor. Let's see, that passes these options up to the parent. So let me minimize that and bring in that line of code and create a table of customers. Now we're not going to seed any data here. We're just going to create the table. So when we insert our first customer, we're not going to seed any data. We're just going to use the web app to put in some customers. So let me bring those lines in for you right there. All right, should be done with that file for a while. So now let's go into our app settings and add in a connection string. And so I'm going to put a comma right here. I'll just paste in my connection string. I'll call this registration CS, registration connection string. Notice that my database is called registration and my connection string is called registration CS. Other than that, very standard connection string. We are using local DB version of SQL Server. Database, trusted connection is true. Multiple active result sets equals true. I'm sorry? Alrighty, now we need to add our registration context to our services in our program CS. So program CS. Right after adding controllers with view, builder, services, add DB context. We called it our registration context. This will bring in our models up top with options, arrow, options, use SQL Server. If you've typed this before, you can definitely copy paste. Builder, configuration, get connection string. Paste the name of your connection string right there. Add a closing parenthesis. The name of our connection string is registration CS. Long line of code to tie it all in together. Okay, we should be able to close these files. Keep customer open. We'll probably come back to that to add these different things we don't have yet. And now we're going to create our first controller, which we are creating a registration page, a registration site. So our controller will be a registration controller, or maybe we call it register controller. And let's bring in our registration context, private, so that we can hit the database. Of course, we're going to have to bring in our models namespace. So notice line 1, we brought in our models. Here's our context file. Let's bring our constructor in to initialize our context using dependency injection. And I'm just going to mark this as a HTTP GET because that's what it is. And we could shorten that with an arrow function to just return a view as such. And so let's wire up that view. Under view, we need a folder called register. And now we need an index view. And this should be a strongly typed view of type customer. Why don't we throw in a title using a razor block. View bag, title, register, registration, new user registration. And I like to change the default so just our landing page is a register controller so that it just kind of boots up into that. Let's boot it up and see what I missed. Otherwise, we should just get a page that says register user in the tab. New user registration, looking good. Yeah, let's go ahead and finish up the database side to create that database. Even though there's no seed data, we can add migration to go ahead and create the database. And here we've got our table. And we will now update the database. If our database design changes, we could always update this database schema, if you will. So let's auto hide some of these windows and go into our local DB. On Object Explorer, local DB, databases, and I already forgot what we called it, registration. There we go. And we should have our one customers table, and at least with the columns, ID, username, email address, date of birth, password. All right, so we can close that migration file. Let's close our program CS. We'll keep our view open here, as well as the controller. All right. As we did yesterday, we're doing both server-side validation and client-side validation. And so to take a look at our shared layout, there is a asynchronous render section async called scripts. And so we should be able to bring in some client-side scripts asynchronously. Next. So we'll write that. Okay, so the code for that is to have a section called scripts. Again, the name has to match. And we're gonna write a razor await HTML, and it was right there, render partial async called validation scripts partial. Again, kind of looking right there, that's our validation scripts partial, which brings in jQuery validation and jQuery unobtrusive validation. Okay, so this is the way. If we boot that up. Apparently have a rogue curly. I don't like that. But if I scroll down into my body, now I've got these scripts that were not there before for jQuery validation. It'd be nice if you could control click that. Let's find my rogue curly right there. All right, let's put a form on here because we are going to be posting a new customer. ASP action is index and method is post. Let's do a div class of row. And how about deflex to get everything, make this a flex box. And so I'll do a label ASP4 username. So the first flex child is our label, form label. Form control, and validation for username, class of text danger. And what's nice about making this a flex box is these three are all flex children, and the default should be to go across the page. And so we should have the label next to the text box next to the error message that's hidden. And of course, I didn't work. What did I do wrong? Hold on. The flex. Maybe I have to form label, input. We got some validation controls. That's good on our input. And our span. I do see one. Okay, no problems there. Let me take a quick look at my flex box. So you take off the class of row and just make a div class of flex box, and then you can do something like justify the content around and get something. You know, the benefit of putting it in a row might be better, because then you can kind of control the spacing here. So let me get rid of my flex box. Check this out. If I do div class of row, then you could do your columns, and you could do stuff like call of 4 and 3 even columns, call of, I don't know, 6 for that one. Close the div. Add up to 12, something like that. 2 for the error. See how that looks. A lot of markup for styling, but that's okay. Okay, definitely shrink the username label, and so maybe do 2. Okay, I can deal with this.
You could like shrink it.
Do what now?
Like shrink.
It's a possibility. If you want to change the styling, I'm fine with that, but just something doesn't look terrible. Okay. So I wound it with div class call of 1 and then 6 for the username. Okay. And I'll just copy that entire row and paste it. The next thing we have is email address. So I'll just change that to email address. Paste and paste. And then after that row, we've got one for, let's copy a whole row again. Date of birth, D-O-B. 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 We've got password and confirm password. Password, one more for confirm password. We got a submit button. So one more div, class of row, and div class offset. kind of offset it by 2 columns just to push it over, basically padding kind of thing. And button type of submit. Close the button, close the div. Close the div. Looking good. Probably some margin on the bottom of all these rows. So let me go to the top here. MB2. I'm going to add that class to all of my rows just to kind of give some breathing room. That looks better. And let's do a catch-all for our validation. Oh, I'm sorry, we don't need a catch-all. We've got built-in error messages off to the side. Yeah, register button right there. Okay, just to pay a little closer attention to the validation that's happening. Again, paying attention to the round trip on the tab, we are getting client-side validation, so our client-side link is working, that asynchronous tag that we wrote. Username is required. Please enter an email address, date of birth, password. If we were to say passwords do not match, again, client-side validation is giving some very snappy validation error messages. Just by changing the letters, you get immediate. And that's the benefit of jQuery. I know you guys haven't done a ton with jQuery, but it is client-side JavaScript that is really good at a couple of things. It's really good at validation, and it's really good at animations. And so if you guys want flashier pages, you know, you can look at jQuery. And jQuery just kind of went in hibernation for a while, but they just had an update, so they're trying to make it more relevant again. There was a while jQuery was falling out of favor, I feel like. And so we can have a birth date that's not 12 years ago, which is a problem that we're going to fix. And if our username has special characters, ooh, that's a nasty error message. Ooh. Nonetheless, it doesn't allow special characters. We'll have to take a look at our model and see if we can clean up that error message. Nonetheless, that's the validation at its current point. Now, the next thing to kind of fix is the fact that we want to look at this date of birth, and we want it to you know, be 18 years old. And as we looked at yesterday, there is a built-in range attribute that doesn't work well with client-side validation. If you guys remember that yesterday, you know, we could come into here on our date of birth and say, hey, like range, and set up like a string that worked from 12 years, and that worked on the server side, but it didn't map very well to the client side. So we're not going to use range. Tony, you had a question?
So the section scripts you added on the index, does
Yes.
it matter if it's at like the top or at the bottom? It just has to be in there, or does it matter?
So it doesn't matter, and here's why. Because notice where it is on the layout is at the bottom. And so you do generally want your JavaScript scripts at the bottom. But because of where it is here, it's going to be put at the bottom, regardless of where you put it at here.
Okay.
Good question. And if you were to inspect the client side, what you see, you would see that it's at the bottom. Okay. So next up is we're going to make a custom attribute. Since the range attribute doesn't work very well with dates, we're going to make a custom attribute. Again, these are attributes that are built in. We're going to make a custom attribute inside of our models. And so let's go into models. Thank you, Tyler. That door can really slam. Models, right click, add, class. Now this is a minimum age attribute. And remember, there's a couple of things to inherit from. To make a server-side attribute, you have to inherit from validation attribute. By the way, one of my favorite hotkeys, control dot, is show potential fixes, and enter is bring in the top fix. Control dot enter is a nice quick one. Yes, sir.
Sorry, did you put that in?
Models.
That's in the model.
That's in models. Yep. Now it's a little usually when you inherit from a parent, you got some methods to override, but this must not have any interfaces, right? Because, however, you do have a method that you need to override here, which is is valid. So we're going to have an instance field. So I'm going to make a private int min years. So we're gonna allow the user, when you use this attribute, to specify 18 years or 13 years, etc. And the way we're gonna do that is in our constructor. So we accept an int in our constructor, and we initialize min years right here. And then we need to write a little logic in our is valid. Now I'm kind of intrigued by what was suggested. I'm not going to use it because I went down a rabbit hole yesterday. So I'm going to just paste my code and then we'll walk through it. I need to, here, this needs to change to validation result. Okay, so our return data type is validation result, and we do not have this get message yet. So that's going to be a compiler error for now. So in walking through the logic here, you have to realize min years is what the programmer sets to be like 13 years or 18 years on the model. And so min years needs to be compared against value. Value will be passed in at runtime. Okay, so that's what you have to compare your min years to the date that's passed in at runtime, which we're calling value. So you can kind of see here, the first thing that's done is we convert value to a date time object. All right, so this is value. Now it's called date to check, and we're adding 18 years and seeing if that is past today. Right, so you're taking the value, adding in the number of years that was specified in the model, and seeing if that's less than today. If it is, then they are at least 18 years old. And so return success. Otherwise, this is going to return an error message that's going to basically say, hey, that's not at least 13 years. Let me bring in this get message. And so you can kind of see the error message that it'll bring in. Here's get message, which get message you'll pass in a username must be at least 18 years ago. And why this is still not compiling is because this actually needs to be protected, and then that will make this nullable here. Okay, And now we got rid of the green squigglies and the red squigglies. Now this is only server-side validation. Okay, so we can actually test this and see how it works on server-side validation at this point. Well, we're getting there. We're very close. Cool. So now that we have this minimum age attribute, and we're going to keep this file open, let's decorate our model with it. So let's go back to customer. Let's go back to date of birth and add in minimum age. And we should be able to pass in 18 years. And let's also provide an error message. So, comma, error message equals okay, now again, this is only server side, so we're gonna have to fix all the validation messages. If I refresh, see that this still comes up, then I'm gonna have to reboot. Close, close. And I'm gonna kind of give everything here. Why did that happen? We got to write the controller to handle the post. We haven't handled the post yet. And so, register controller for a post. Connor?
Before we create a post, shouldn't that have showcased that we weren't 18?
No. Remember, this is only server side. Right. Public action results index. Now we're expecting a customer to come in. And if model state is valid, else add the customer, save the changes, and return index home controller index method. That's fine. Otherwise, return the view customer. Cool, custom attribute working on the server side, not on the client side, on the server side. So now we're going to get it working in both. All right, next up is to get that working on the client side, which was the challenge yesterday. So hopefully we don't hit those same speed bumps today. On our attribute, when we inherit from validation attribute, that is for the server side. To get it working on the client side, we need iClient model validator. That is correct. Then control.enter to bring in the using statement, which is ASP.NET Core MVC model binding validation, looking good. control dot again to bring in the interface, implement interface, enter. Adds in this add validation method, public void add validation with a context. I'm just going to call this CTX. And I will show you the code to bring in, and then we'll walk through it. What we're doing here, if you're seeing this context attributes add, well, didn't mean to do that. If you see here, context CTX attributes add, data val, data hyphen val minimum years, data hyphen val minimum age. Remember, data val attributes are custom HTML attributes that you can add to elements in your HTML. And so what this winds up doing is adding attributes to our front end tags, like our input tags. I don't know that they're there yet, but if we kind of inspect this input, data val minimum years 18, data val minimum age, you can kind of see the error message, you must be at least 18 years old. And so minimum age and years and data val of true, right? You can kind of see that we've added these data val attributes to our markup that will be used by the client-side script to kind of generate some error messages for us. And so essentially we've added these attributes that will be used by unobtrusive jQuery for our error messages. Hope that makes sense. Okay, so a couple of good questions. See, this if statement here could be written with a set of curlies, but they're optional, right? So if you just kind of view it as that, that's what this if statement is. But again, if you have one statement, curlies are not mandatory, right? So this is just a more condensed syntax without curlies. And another kind of discussion point that didn't get recorded that I'll just repeat is what we're doing here is we're just setting this up on the client side so that your client side validation rules match your server side validation rules. So you don't have like different sets of like you pass client side validation and then you have to pass server side validation. You want matching validation rules on both sides. Okay, so now we've kind of set up the attributes on the client. Now what? Now we need to write a little bit of custom client side validation and add it to the jQuery library. So this is kind of not something you do every day. So the way to do this is in www-root. We've got a JavaScript folder, and I'm going to add a JavaScript file. So I'm going to add a new item, and then you gotta find. If you click on ASP.NET Core, you should be able to find a JavaScript file. And we'll call it minimum hyphen age. You know, it would be nice if that server-side logic, so what did we write server-side? We wrote this server-side logic in C#, but now we have to kind of replicate this in JavaScript, right, to do this on the client as well. And so here's kind of some code to do that. Now obviously this is JavaScript, and we're writing a method. Notice we're writing a method called minimum age. So jQuery validator add method. This is all weird because we're adding methods to a previously existing library called minimum age, and the function kind of begins here. Notice the inputs are the date and time called value, this element that really isn't used, and param, which is that number of years, which is 18 in our case. So again, we have value, which is the date and time. We have param, which is what you're checking it against. Again, we already wrote this logic in C#. This is just how you write it kind of in JavaScript. Obviously, if value is empty, that's not going to pass validation. You know, if invalid date, if it's not a valid date object, it's going to come back as invalid date. That's not going to pass validation. Let's cast 18 into a number and set date to check equal to the year plus 18, and then return true or false if the date to check is less than today. So 18 years ago, return true or false if it's over 18 years, or if it's, you know, less than, I should say. 18-year difference, return true, otherwise return false. And then there's one more line to finish off the job of adding it to jQuery. So this adds it to jQuery, and this unobtrusive is another library. This adds it to this unobtrusive, minimum age single year. So we're adding it to both jQuery and unobtrusive jQuery libraries. Again, this is kind of weird, not something you do every day. So I'm just kind of going with the code that works as a demo. Now, what I want to do is I want to add this minimum age age JS to my partial scripts, right? So I've got views, and here's my scripts partial. So I'm going to add another script tag here. The path is JS, minimum age JS. And then the next thing to do is just test that it is in fact brought in. If I refresh my front end and I go down to the bottom, we should see jQuery validate, jQuery unobtrusive, and there's my JS minimum age. If I copy and paste that onto the end of localhost, we should hit that JavaScript file just to validate that the linking is working. Console's clear. It does say one issue, but I don't think that's a problem at this point. And let's see if I forgot anything. So let's just hit, there you go. Wonderful. We got client-side validation. All we had to do is change it. And that makes me happy. Now if I scroll back 18 years, which would put me at 10 years ago would be 14, 2006-ish. And January 3rd, I would expect that to work. But let's scroll past February, March. Somewhere in here I would expect it to start breaking. There it is. There it is. 18 years ago to the date. Okay, so again, just to revisit where I'm at, is we have client-side validation now working for our custom attribute, which is very cool. As soon as I hit here, you must be at least 18 years old without having to click the register button, right? Therefore, we know it's client-side validation. You scroll that calendar back 18 years and it works. The next thing to do, and this is kind of a simple fix, and with a little bit of CSS, we can style, because all of these inputs, once they have a validation error message, they have a class of input validation error. All right, so with a little bit of custom CSS, we can put like red boxes around that. So I'm gonna maybe close some things I don't need, and probably come back. Okay, minimum age should be good for now. So let me go into CSS, site CSS, and I'm going to target that class, input validation error. Basically a red, but 3545. This is the same red of text danger in Bootstrap, so that's the reasoning for that red. Border 2 pixels solid, background color, and I don't really know what color this resolves to. So that's kind of an easy fix to make it a little more how do you say annoying to the user. And refresh and register, and there you go. So there you go, there's that background color of whatever that is, beige and red. So that's an easy thing to do. Okay, let's register a user and see, because kind of the next thing we want to do is make sure that the user, which is also very cool. The next thing that we're going to work on is make sure that the user is not already registered, right? So we're going to actually round trip to the database using kind of like this AJAX kind of call, like you're using JavaScript to hit the database. Right, so this is going to be client side, and pull data out of the database and see if the user already exists. You know, I'm thinking like, you guys know what AJAX is in the sense of like, if you've used Gmail and you get a new email, it just pops up on the screen, right? You don't actually have to click a button; it just works with a server call, right? So, anyways, let's register a user. Now it's going to spin a little bit. Okay, that happened kind of quick. I thought it was going to take longer. And let's now hit our database and make sure that my user is registered. So if I view data, good, got a new user. And so next up, we're going to check the email address to see if the email address is there before we allow evangudmested@gmail.com to register again. And so we're going to do this by adding a validation controller. So let me close. I don't know that I'm going to come back to minimum age, so I'll close that. Now this was working yesterday, so if you guys in my class followed along, you did this yesterday, but it's good to do it again. So this is a validation controller. And again, what this is that remote attribute. That remote attribute is built in. Validation controller inherits from controller. And we're going to bring in a context, private. Public, I'm writing a constructor, validation controller, registration context, there we go. Now, this one is kind of cool because it has the return data type of JSON results. And we're going to write check email. Okay, so here, if, and I'm going to glance at this. If we hit the database, if the email address, then we return JSON already exists. Otherwise, else return JSON of true. Let me compare that real quick. Okay, I kind of like this a little bit better than what I did before, so I'm going to keep this, and if it doesn't work, we can always backtrack, but I think it'll be just fine. Okay, so pretty simple. We add a validation controller, one method to check an email. You can see you're either going to get email already exists or true, as in it passes validation. Right? So JSON of trues, passing validation. This is a failing validation. And what we do now is we are able to decorate our email address with this remote attribute, and I think that just brought in, did that bring one in? I don't know. So here's our three usings. I'm not sure. Data annotations. This might be a different namespace. Regardless. So in remote, we pass in two strings. The first string is the name of the method, check email. And the second is the name of the controller, validation. So the validation controller, check email method. And that's incredibly easy if that's all it takes. Now, and I did notice yesterday this was let me close. It was doing more of a client side versus a server side. Like it was happening before I had to click register. Would you boot up, machine? Quit making me wait on you. There we go. Okay, so Evan Gudmestead, let me just see if I tab off. There it goes. Because it does hit a database, it does take a second. So it wasn't like the snappiest response, but if I just ping that, notice it pops right off. That's incredibly easy. That's probably my favorite. I like that a whole lot more, that remote attribute, a whole lot more than like customizing your jQuery unobtrusive validation logic, and that's pretty awesome. Let me see what I'm forgetting. Yeah, I think that's it. That covered all the bases. That covered both the remote and the custom attributes that are not built in. So, cool. We'll stop it there.